Well, thank you, Rupert. That's a lot to think about.
That.
Lot to think about.
Seems I've been listening to arguments about how the problems of people not getting adequate food supplies since I was a kid helping my mother with Oxfam.
Sure you have.
And it's always been said, well, we grow enough food and it's a question of distribution. But the fact is that economics and political systems will go on dictating that people don't have enough to eat. So I think that you can't restrict
that's defeatism, surely.
No, I'm not defeatist about it at all. I think that there are a multitude of different ways that we can contribute towards solving the problem to get around the political and the economic strictures that impose these things. I don't think,
what I mean is it's political defeatism. You're saying that the only thing we can do is something like new technologies or whatever, but I say, no, we need to have political and economic answers as well.
No, I'm not saying the only way. I'm certainly not saying the only way. I'm saying that's fine. Go ahead and fight those economic and political battles. Mm-hmm. But whatever you want to come out with at the end, you're going to need to have crops that produce more and produce more nutritious food in the future. You can't get away from that.
No.
It cannot be solved without, and
Right, yes. I don't disagree. And I don't disagree with virtually all what you said. I'm for the agroecology type of model. And I think it is all about profit. Hello, Jonathan.
Have we got an umpire? He's a fine leg, is he?
Yeah. The issue is, if you like, I think we'll come back to the politics and the economics, but taking up your point, Cath, if you think we should nevertheless be doing things to improve food despite what's going on, then I think my concern is that we have a very narrow focus on which sort of crops we're looking at. We're looking at wheat, we're looking at soy, we're looking at maize. We're not looking at fruit and vegetables, we're not looking at grass.
I am.
Well, good. But overall, so for instance, the statistics, which I did when I was last here, I was collecting the statistics from the FAO, and a point Peter was making was, of all the countries that Rupert, so you call me Chris, so I'm Charlie, so we're doing very well.
I'll call you my friend, it's perfectly okay.
Right, Rupert. Right. So back to that point, that Britain itself is probably the worst offender of all in causing the world food problem. We are more dependent on anybody, any other country in the world for food coming from elsewhere. Basically, while Tesco's and Sainsbury's can lift up the phone and get food from Kenya, New York, you name it, then we're not producing enough food of our own. And it's not just the recent, it goes back 150 years, it's obviously to the Corn Laws and that whole change of what went on then. But just in the last 15 years, I did the calculations using the FAO stats, was that Britain's contribution to the total world food population is only 1 to 2%. It's only small, right? But that contribution in terms of wheat and grain has gone down by a third. In terms of meat, it's gone down by a half. And in terms of fruit and vegetables, it's gone down by 2/3. So our contribution
over what period?
About 15 years, between about 2005 and 1990.
And to what do you attribute that?
Because we're just not investing in the land and in food. Because everybody wants cheap food, and while they can get cheap food from abroad, that's all anybody's interested in. The politicians don't want to hear about paying more for the food. The customers don't want to hear. And we've got the message I think we've got to get out is we've got to pay more for our food. And we've got to invest in our land and our sciences much more. We've seen our science. This is the thing I bang on about most. And there's some fabulous scientists around still.
Yes, there are.
But the science that when I was growing up has virtually gone. Newcastle, where I did my first degree, there's no science there anymore. College, probably the best agricultural in the world at the time, closed down by Imperial College. And we've seen Wellesbourne closed down. We've seen Grasslands gone. We've seen Long Ashton gone. We've seen Monkswood, the ecological research station. We've seen 17 or 18 research stations gone. We've seen ADAS, the Agricultural Development Advisory Service, virtually gone, now only commercial. And the government is carrying out a consultation at the moment on agrotechnology and says we're world leaders in this science. And I think, I'm sorry, there are some fine people, but the overall structure just isn't there anymore.
I think they are supporting John Innes, aren't they?
Yes, John Innes and Rothamsted are the two public sector research stations which are left. East Malling in private hands.
As the Institute
Plant
of
breeding
Animal
gone.
Health.
Yeah. My argument is we should have a much better, more vibrant public sector science.
I absolutely support that. But then I think that we have to be, in addition to that, I think that we need to be as innovative as possible in terms of thinking about how we can actually address this challenge of,
Yes.
and it's not necessarily, the challenge of getting enough food for the world is not necessarily going to be for the very poorest people, but it's because Asia is increasing in population at such an enormous rate, and that they're demanding less and less sustainable types of food. For example, meat rather than...
what's going on in China, everybody quotes the middle class eating more meat, and that's certainly part of the issue. They're taking in lamb from New Zealand now, so lamb prices are high at the moment. Hence, there are still sheep on our hills. Thank you very much, Leslie. But the big thing which is going on in China, when I was there about 6 months ago, you could actually see, I went out into the countryside just for a couple of afternoons, and I was expecting everybody to be tilling and cutting and chipping and the noise of the countryside. Nothing going on, but there was bindweed growing over the orchards. It's been run down because something like 120 million people, often young women, have moved from the country into the towns to work. And what do they want there? What does the state want there? Cheap food. So where's that cheap food coming from? It's not coming from China anymore. It's coming from Brazil, basically. Most of it. So they are repeating what we did 150 years ago, of having an industrial revolution, part of which requires cheap food so they can pay the workers less.
I think the scientists that I know in China are fully aware that they have to move back towards self-sufficiency. Soya is the biggest problem for them because they're not self-sufficient in soya, and that's why they're investing a huge amount in. And
there's talk about them having farms in the cities and the state actually putting in an awful lot, which would make a heck of a lot of sense.
I think that's absolutely right. I think we should have more of that in this country too. We should have more urban fringe agriculture and urban agriculture.
Yes, I was thinking what you said about trees in crops. I remember many years ago there was a theory that it was a very good thing to do, but the farmers just couldn't cope with it, the machinery,
Yes, well, there are only certain...
There was a lot of land near Peterborough that they planted trees on, and they all sort of rather joked about it, because taking your combine harvester around the trees
that's part of the issue. Silso, another research station in the public sector, has gone. So the engineering is dependent on big multinationals, the John Deere's and the International, who have no interest in this sort of technology at all. They're interested in the big machines around here. But if we wanted to, I'm on the Incredible Edibles at Todmorden on their board, where we're growing fruit and vegetables in the town, so people can pick. We've got a little plot of land or whatever. But we wanted little machines, and there aren't many of them because the big companies aren't interested in developing those sorts of.
And with these giant machines that you're getting the soil compaction you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. But if I could go back to what Cathie was saying about the need to get more people to live off the land. We are in an era of an absurd level of urbanisation, and this is sooner or later going to have to turn around. Either it's going to be turned around by basically cataclysmic collapse type style developments in the next 50 to 100 years, or we're going to start to turn it around voluntarily. And in countries like this country, and in countries like China, but in many countries around the world, one of the worst things that we're doing is suggesting to people that what you want to be doing is definitely living in a city, and what you ought to be doing is getting involved in industrialization and so on and so forth. And what we ought to be doing is one way of putting it, a slightly extreme way of putting it, but I think it's an apposite way of putting it, is promoting the peasant lifestyle to those people who want to have it. And there are millions, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who that's exactly what they want. The Via Campesina movement is arguably the biggest movement of people in the entire world. It's hundreds of millions of people who basically live a subsistence way of life. And what they want is for people to stop trying to force them and encourage them and bribe them and so on to stop doing so, and developing their countries in such a way that it's no longer possible for them to live off the land.
What about crops and cropping?
Sorry, I just wanted to say I didn't say anything about making more people live off the land. I really don't see that as being something that I would champion. I find it rather distasteful that we're saying that we either that we should be pushing people to live a peasant lifestyle, or I mean, I think people have to be able to decide that for themselves.
Lots of people have this rural dream, don't they?
Yes.
Well, we do.
Yes, they like
there are many
postcards,
people,
but they don't like working.
No, that's different.
There are many people all around the world. There's tens of millions of them, possibly hundreds of millions of them in India, for example, who are being pushed off the land. The same thing is happening in China, right? So it's not about saying everyone should be forced to work on the land. It's about saying if people want to live on the land, and more people are going to have to live on the land probably than are living on the land right now. If people want to, for God's sake, let's not stop them, and let's reverse all the kind of terrible kind of trade rules and economic subsidies and stupid development programs and so on that say, well, we want to get people off the land so we can push them all into factories and have them all working there.
Well,
this is what you were saying.
Rupert, sounds a fine idea, but it's a terrible uphill struggle to achieve that.
It is. Yeah, we're talking about a big change in our ways of acting and a big change in our ways of thinking.
Well, it basically comes back to, rather than seeing food as something cheap which has to be shoveled down as quickly as possible in order to dash off and put in 48 hours work, which is the way it is we have to value it, we have to pay for it, and we have to invest in the land. In which case I then see the capital building up on the land, which has never really happened in Britain. It has in some other countries much more. That your cheese making factories and your butchers and whatever actually on the land or near the land. So the industry and the money builds up and is made locally and is spent locally. And I'm all much more for localism in a whole variety of forms. I don't see it happening in one go.
Well,
and I don't see many people dashing out of London to live in a peasant existence in the hills.
Our supermarkets get no end of food from abroad, don't they?
Yes. The figures at the moment are that I would keep quoting 15, but my mate Tim is quoting 18 billion pounds worth of food is being imported into this country, which we could grow ourselves. One side is over intensified, and the other one is under. What we want is a much more even distribution. So, and my big concern is there's no investment in research going on my side of the country, and yet I think, well, actually, this is very important. If you want to increase the food production in Britain, you actually have more fruit and vegetable on the west side of the country. That would do more for your health and for the balance of payments